My name is Brian Whetstone, and I'm stating for the record that today is Friday, April 13th, 2018, and I'm here interviewing Lanae Hall at Perkins Library at Hastings College. So just to get started off with, could you tell me when and where you were born?
I was born in North Platte. We didn't live in North Platte, but I was born in North Platte and grew up around North Platte for a few years.
Mm-hmm. Did you grow up on a farm?
We lived out in the country, and my dad was a farmhand for a couple of years. Then he worked for a welding company for a few years too.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it wasn't a farm. It was just out in the country.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What did your mom do?
My mom was pretty much a homemaker. Yeah.
And did you have many siblings?
I did not have a sibling until I was 6 years old.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And what were their names? What was their name?
I only have one brother, and his name is Larry.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what were your parents' names?
My dad's name is Ralph, and my mom's name is Leila.
Okay. Are they both still alive?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
They are
awesome.
still alive.
Do they still live in the North Platte area?
They live in Alliance now. We moved there when I was about 12.
Okay.
After we had a series of other moves, we spent some time in the Valentine area from the time I was 5 until I was 12, and then ever since I was 12, my parents have been in Alliance in the same house.
Okay.
So yeah.
And what brought them on that journey from like Valentine then to Alliance?
Well, my dad worked with the Game and Parks Commission for a really long time, and that's what got them to Valentine. And then there was kind of some unfortunate stuff that went on with his job. He didn't have a very good boss, and so he ended up losing his job and spending a long time looking for work all around the state. I can remember it was I was probably a little bit shielded from how stressful it was since I was a little kid,
Mm-hmm.
but my dad had a really hard time with that period in his life, and it was really hard for him to find work. So he went all over the state looking for work, and then he finally found work at a John Deere place in Alliance. So we packed up and trekked off to Alliance.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
And so then Alliance is where you spent most of
Mm-hmm.
your childhood after 12 growing up.
We moved in the middle of my 6th grade year.
Okay.
So it was a little bit interesting, you know.
Yeah. So where did you finish up? Did you finish all through 12th grade
I did.
in Alliance?
Yeah.
Okay. What activities did you participate in at school?
I was not what you'd say the most socially involved kid. I was a little bit different, and part of that had to do with the fact that I grew up in a more fundamentalist type of religion, which it was Christian based, but a little bit different than my peers, and so some of the expectations for kids growing up in my particular faith is that we would be different than the other kids. Like not dress the same, not talk the same. And so I kind of looked different, what the clothes I wore, and my parents were a little bit poor, and so then that was another thing. But kids kind of notice when you don't go to the same church as they do, any of them. And, I was a little bit maybe isolated, and so I didn't get involved in like a lot of activities.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't do sports, I wasn't into sports. I did do some academic activities because academics was more my thing. So, there were a couple of clubs like that I was a part of, but I really wasn't, a club sort of person either.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I'm a little, my childhood and teen years are a little bit boring because I was not like super achieving, super involved.
What I think is interesting about the church, was there a church in Alliance that your family was able to go to?
This church is interesting in the sense that it doesn't have like a denominational affiliation, therefore there wasn't like a church building to go to. The church was always based in the home.
Oh.
Like you could go to, like not just in Nebraska or the United States, but all the way around the world. There, this fellowship has its kind of its web around the world, I guess. That's what comes to mind. And it meets in the home, and that's one of the hallmarks of the church is that it meets in the home because in the early Bible days, that's part of what they did is they met in each other's homes, and so that's kind of a tradition that got started back around 1897 when the guy that's really like the founder of our church, that church movement, he felt like that was when people needed to be following the Bible, and that's what they did in the Bible, met in each other's homes, and the ministers didn't have a home, they didn't have a salary, so the ministers kind of remain itinerant in that fellowship and, move from home to home. But basically, so there would be a home in a community that was like the meeting home, and that's where you went.
So is there more than one family, or was it just you guys in Alliance?
There were several other families, actually, yeah.
And so then you just kind of traded?
Well, the ministers that were in charge determined, this is the meeting home, for like Wednesday night, you'll go here, and for Sunday morning, you'll go here. And depending on how many, if there were a lot of families in an area, there might be more than one meeting home for Wednesday and for Sunday. And then you would kind of be assigned to, a particular home. And so that was where you went. That was like your church home.
Mm-hmm.
So.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
How did your religion affect your views growing up?
Well, because they had some pretty conservative views, I was taught that things like, alternative sexualities were not acceptable. So when I realized that I had attractions, for the same gender or the same sex, that was not considered acceptable. And I didn't have to ask anybody to know that it wasn't acceptable. That was just a message that was there. And it didn't necessarily have to be preached, although occasionally, people, ministers or other fellowship members would make comments. Maybe they didn't really have to, because it was just accepted that things like that were, wrong. They were wicked. They were abominations or whatever. And I when I was a teenager, I went looking in my Bible, because first of all, I was studious. Second of all, I was really spiritually inclined, and it really mattered to me to be not just morally right, but spiritually right, and I wanted to please God, as it were, because that was something that was taught to me was like one of the main purposes of life, is you please God. So I go looking in the Bible to find answers to what's going on, inside of me. And those were pretty, what I found was pretty uncomfortable. And so at the time, I didn't have access to, other interpretations or for anybody to explain to me, the linguistic aspects or the sociocultural aspects of the Bible or whatever. It's just basically, so this is what the Bible said, and here's the message that I was taught. And so that the conclusion I drew is that, my sexuality was an abomination, which meant that something about me was an abomination. So I think that's a really long-winded answer to your question.
No, but it got to what I was wondering.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess, when were you first aware of that different sexual identity?
Probably when I was about 13. Although I think there were things, prior to that if I'd been paying more attention, or if I'd had a way of defining them, I think there were things that were going on that were pointing, me in that direction. But I was about 13 when it really became clear to me that, I don't seem to have these attractions to boys that all of my girl classmates do, and that is interesting. But I do think that my girl classmates are, attractive, and I kind of had crushes on some older women, like some older women ministers, which was pretty awkward. Yeah. Pretty awkward. And by, one of them that I was closer to, down the road, and she was smart enough to figure stuff out, and she was actually very kind and gentle about it. So when I'm talking about my church, I don't mean to imply that everybody was kind of mean about it or unkind about it. I mean, they had their beliefs, but there were an awful lot of kind people, too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that I had people telling me that I was a bad person. That's kind of the way I internalized it, is that I was a bad person because of the sexuality and all that. So, when I was 13 and I realized more clearly that this is what's going on, that's when I started doing my searching for answers and trying to understand that and figure out what it meant for me and my future and,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
What did that search involve?
Well, I did I read the Bible, looking for any verses that could be said to have any connection with, sex or sexuality or whatever. And it's not like, I don't think that I knew of the word homosexual then. I didn't have some of the language that is available now. For kids now that are doing this same search, there's this whole language that's already available and more present and accessible. But when you're growing up in Alliance, Nebraska in the early 1990s, some of this language hadn't even been developed. And what there was hadn't quite made its way there yet. So I didn't have some of that language to even understand what I was searching for. And yet, because I was good at words and good at thinking, I could puzzle out some of it for myself. And so I knew that I was looking for stuff about love and relationships and what was considered acceptable in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I have never really thought of asking anybody questions about it.
And that's going to be my next question.
Yeah.
So is there someone you could confide to, or?
No, there really wasn't. And I couldn't tell my parents because to them it would have been a difficult thing, and they wouldn't have had answers. And besides that, there was a lot of stress in my early teenage years because my brother had a lot of difficulties, with his kind of personality and acting out sort of issues, and so there was a lot of stuff that was on my parents' mind, and so I don't know, it just never even occurred to me anymore at that point to put that on my parents. And I don't think there was enough trust between me and my parents. I felt like things weren't safe, and so I felt like they weren't safe, and I didn't know that anyone was really safe to tell that stuff to.
Yeah.
And, even though a lot of people would have been kind, I just don't think it would have been a safe thing to talk about. Or at least, that was certainly my teenage feeling about the matter.
Yeah. So how did the feelings sort of evolve as you grew up from being a teenager and moving into adulthood?
Like from when I was 13 moving forward?
Yeah.
It was interesting. When I was about 15 and I was at a church convention, I experienced, and that I believe it was a genuine spiritual experience, but I felt like, God or the Spirit, or, at that time I would have just referred to it as God, like the voice of God speaking to me, that I was supposed to go into ministry work, and the only form of ministry I knew was the form of ministry that was present in the church that I was in. And so I presume the call to ministry meant, to go into that sort of fellowship. But for me, obviously because of the sexuality issues and other things, there was actually an incongruity in what I believed and what I was supposed to teach as a minister. So, but nonetheless, I believed that I'd been called, and so that was kind of, from when I was 15 on, that's what governed my life. I didn't think about getting married, or, the idea of marriage, I don't know. I couldn't see myself married, probably for obvious reasons. I just couldn't see myself married. And so I think even though the call was real, I also looked at it as a way to protect myself from having to live this, kind of a false life. But it, was kind of a false life anyway, because I wasn't being my real self all along. So, in answer to how, I dealt with some of the developing feelings is I took refuge more in my spirituality, and in the sense that I was going to be called into this ministry work, and I was going to be married to God, as it were, and so I didn't have to worry about these other things. But obviously things that aren't dealt with don't go away, and so then I'm getting way ahead of your question.
Oh, no, you're fine.
Okay.
We don't have to stick to this. This is fine.
All right. Well, very good. So I went off to college, and I was at Lincoln for a year, and then I got really depressed. I got really kind of suicidally depressed, and I ended up back home for a while. And, I got better, and then I got a job, and I lived in an apartment, and I was working at this factory. And
this was still in Alliance?
This was still in
Okay.
Alliance, yeah. And so, it was really interesting because when I got hired, the male supervisor said I would be working with a bunch of women, and would I have a problem with that? And I was thinking I'd rather work with a bunch of women than a bunch of guys. Well, I learned a few things. But on my crew, there was this woman that she was gay. And it came about, I had my 21st birthday, and then a couple months after that, she and this other woman, who was also gay, but I didn't know that at that time, they decided to get me drunk one night. And then, so I ended up at the house of my first colleague, and, a lot of interesting stuff happened, which I was never quite sure how to categorize that experience, because it wasn't exactly consensual, because I didn't ask for it, and yet it, I was also curious, so I allowed it to happen, and it wasn't much fun. It really wasn't much fun, but it always kind of left me thinking, what would an experience with, a real experience be like with somebody who really cared about me and wasn't using me and manipulating me? What would that be like? But because I had all these kind of confused guilt feelings and shame feelings, I confided in this minister friend of mine who'd been like a mentor to me and had always been kind to me. Mm-hmm. And at this time I had already offered myself for the ministry work, so that offer was there. And then I talked to her about this experience that had happened, and then she goes and talks to the head guy, they call an overseer, and they're all, it's kind of the patriarchal thing, they're all guys. So then it came that it was, church convention time, which was in June, and all the workers were there, and there was a church convention that was near Alliance. I keep, as I'm telling the story, I'm like, I need to set more of these details. But so it was like a church convention type of thing where, hundreds of people in the fellowship would come, and lots of workers would come, and you would all sit and listen to a lot of preaching for a few days. And so, she talked to the head overseer, and so then I end up having this really uncomfortable conversation with this guy, and I almost got kicked out of being accepted, basically.
Oh, really?
Because I'd had this experience, or because I had this persuasion. And so so then he was like, how are we supposed to know you're not going to be making passes at your coworkers? Because we would have same gender companions. The women would travel together as pairs working together, and men would travel in pairs working together. And this, sometimes there had been inappropriate relationships. I mean, nobody told me that at the time, but over the years I've learned that there was a history of, inappropriate relationships like that happening, because some people were like me and had that persuasion. So he was wanting to make sure I would behave myself if they still accepted me.
And what did you say to him when he asked that?
I said, of course I would behave myself, because there wasn't too many, my potential coworkers that I was interested in making. And besides that, I mean, I felt it was a little bit insulting that he didn't give my morals more credit than that. It was totally not my style to make passes at somebody. I didn't even have any idea how you operated this stuff, So I wouldn't have done that, because if I'd gone into ministry work, that would have been my focus. This is what I'm doing. I'm not here to have this relationship. I'm here to serve and to preach and, to be in ministry. So, but that was a really uncomfortable period of my life. That really caused me to have to do some in-depth, exploration of how I was going to deal with my identity. And so obviously my choice was that I was not going to express my identity. I was going to give it up or let it go, because that was, what I was taught was the right thing to do, was leave that sort of fleshly thing behind, or that,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So then did you end up going into
I did.
the ministry?
I did eventually. I was about, when was that? It was in 1999, so I was about 22, and I spent 3 years in ministry work.
And where did they have you? What does that entail?
What did that entail? To kind of back up and set the background a little bit, so in Nebraska and Kansas then were a combined area, and so you'd have this whole pool of workers, and so then you'd have the head overseer, and he would assign, there were certain areas in Nebraska, like in western Nebraska, or in Broken Bow, Kearney, Lincoln, Omaha, different fields they called them, and so pairs of workers would be assigned to these fields. And so, when I got accepted into the ministry, then I started out at a church convention in York, and that was in September. And so then I got assigned this older lady as my companion, and we went to. I started in Broken Bow. Actually, no, I'm getting my details all mixed up. I did not start at York. I started in April, in the middle of the year. So I went and joined my companion in Broken Bow. But a lot of times, when young workers or new workers started, they started from the convention. So, yeah. But the accurate part of my story is that I started in the middle of the year, so I kind of got tossed in, sort of, in the middle of things. But that's basically how it would work. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you said you did that for about 3 years.
I did. Yeah.
Okay.
And so each year you would, you might. If the older one might get sent back to the same area, but when you were a younger one, you would get sent to in a different area each year, and probably usually with a different coworker each year. And so, it's a pretty challenging lifestyle, basically. I mean, because you never really got to have roots as far as having your own home or your own family, but it was also beautiful in the sense that everybody was your family. And everybody's home was your home. And so there's a lot of beautiful things about it. Yeah.
That's interesting. It is a beautiful, philosophy, sort of universal home. But
yeah.
So when did you leave the ministry?
I left it almost exactly 3 years after I joined. And kind of this thing is, another thread that weaves through my history is that I had trouble with depression. I had a lot of psychological difficulties, and I think a lot of it really did stem from the fact that I was not able to reconcile my sexuality, that part of myself, with who I was taught to be in my religion. And so there was always these parts of me that were at odds, and so I couldn't be, and I wasn't my real self ever. And the incongruity and the dissonance, it does a great deal of psychological damage, and so I think it caused me a lot of distress. And so, when I was 13, I had difficulties. A little bit later in my teenage years, I did. When I was in college, I did, and then kind of toward the end of my time in the ministry, I had a lot of difficulties too with that. And so, it wasn't that I necessarily wanted to leave, but it was also the right thing to leave. And I kind of always planned that I would go back, but that's not how life worked.
Yeah.
I ended up married. Of all things.
So how did that work? How did that happen?
Well, that was really interesting, and there's a lot of beautiful aspects to this story too. I mean, you can look at it, if you look at it from terms of a love story, there's a lot of really cool components to it. But anyway, so the man who ended up becoming my husband, he was in ministry work too. He was 20 years older than me. So he found this fellowship and joined when he was about 20, which is the year I was born. So we always kind of joked that we were born the same year. I was physically born, he was spiritually born. But he went in the ministry, and so he'd been in the ministry for about 23 years, but he was kind of having this sense that, you could kind of in a cliche way call it a midlife crisis, but he felt like he was being called out of the ministry and into a relationship. And so he was having kind of these torments, with his sexual desires and stuff. And he was having some pretty difficult experiences. And he was actually in the Spanish work at that time. He was in Guatemala.
Oh, wow.
So he was down there, and and he tells the story of how he was praying about what his future would look like, and he knew that he was going to get sent back to Nebraska, and he kind of knew he knew of me from like when I was about 16, so that's why he had me in his head somehow. But so he's praying, and so then he gets this really clear impression that, if he's sent back to Nebraska and he's sent to Kearney, where I was at that time, that this is a sign that he should pursue me, that I'm the one that will get married, that will have a family. And I have no clue that this is going on, I'm just in Kearney minding my business, trying to get well, trying to put my life together, whatever. And so then, lo and behold, he comes back to Nebraska, and he's assigned to be in Kearney, and there I am, and it's kind of interesting. I'm working in the grocery store, and so for half the year, he's, this is 2002, the end of 2002, and I'd left in April, so I've been living in Kearney for several months, and he comes there, and he's still a worker, but I'm not, even though I didn't really have much experience with relationships, I'm not totally dense. I can pick up these vibes, and I started having weird dreams, and he was in my dreams, and I'd be working at the grocery store, and he'd come by, and it was like, I was getting some weird vibes, but I didn't know how to define them because, he's still in the work, and I had no clue he was leaving. And then he goes and leaves in December. And the lady I was staying with, she went off to Argentina to help with the ministry work down there. So I was going to be like house sitter. And as soon as she's gone, he sends me an email, and he's like, let's get together. And I'm like, this is totally inappropriate. She just, I'm here alone, and she just left, and you just left the work, and this is totally inappropriate. Absolutely not, And besides that, I was still thinking, I want to go back into the ministry work because I don't see any other, vision for my life. I didn't have any other visions. Like, I didn't want to get married because, but after a few months, and then I had another conversation with this lovely head worker person in which I was strongly encouraged to look into other alternatives, which meant we're, if you insist, we might take you back in the ministry, but we would rather not. And I can get a hint. It had to kind of be delivered like that, but I could get a hint. So I kind of screwed up my little bit of courage, and I went back and I said to him, okay, let's try this and see how it goes. And I really can't understand exactly why to this day. I mean, if I'm a gay person, why, the spirit or the presence or whatever universal force you want to call that kind of moves through the scheme of things, why that moved me into this marriage exactly, I don't know, other than the fact I think my kids are supposed to exist. But so I found myself in this relationship, and it was really difficult for me to reconcile myself to the fact that it seemed to be moving toward marriage, and I didn't see any other, again, it was a case where I didn't have other options available. I didn't have resources available, other people that could tell me, you have other options, you really could do this, you really could own your identity, you don't have to get married, blah, blah, blah. I didn't really have any other option that I knew of. So, it was really a difficult time, and I kind of, I would run away from the relationship and run back toward it and kind of, and I'm sure that was really painful for him too, because he was pretty dead set. He wanted me. And he ended up getting me, for 13 years anyway. Yeah. So, getting married, that was maybe one of the weirdest things that happened in my life. It was completely unexpected. Me in a marriage with a man when I'd never felt called to marriage, especially, well, at that time I couldn't even imagine having like a serious relationship with a woman or being openly gay or anything. But I also couldn't imagine being married to a guy, and here I ended up, I was married to a guy, and, and it was it took me a while to adjust to, not being in the ministry and being married. And then when I got pregnant 3 months into the marriage, then that was like another,
That's a lot.
It was a dizzying sort of thing, It was really difficult to deal with that and kind of learn to reconcile myself to the fact that this is what my life was for right now. And I kind of, at that point, from that point on, figured that this was my life, and I also understood that those other parts of myself were still there. And I thought, well, maybe it'll just be enough if I just, they're there, but they don't get to be expressed. Maybe that'll be okay, And you can get that idea in your life, but that doesn't mean that it's actually going to be okay. If you're not living authentically and you're kind of torn apart internally and you're not whole inside, then it's not going to be okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, what year did you get married?
It was 2003.
Okay.
November of 2003.
And I'm curious, just because I grew up in Kearney.
Mm-hmm.
What grocery store did you work at?
Bogart's.
Okay. I have fond memories of Bogart's.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I guess, how did you reconcile the life you were living with the identity you still were grappling with? That
I was still aware of. Well, again, it was just kind of a case of I didn't know anything else was possible, and I didn't have psychological resources. I didn't have practical resources. I didn't have support, to help me envision or take the steps to live a different life. And so I decided to accept that this is the life that I had. And the thing about my church faith is it's one of those church faiths that's pretty certain that it's the only right way, and that's a message that's really deeply embedded in you. And so, my roots in my faith were deep, even though there were all sorts of things that I was aware I didn't agree with this and I didn't agree with that. And I was always aware I was a little bit different, and I was always seen as a little bit different because my viewpoints didn't always jive with the ones that I was supposed to have. No matter how hard I tried to conform, I never quite did. And so I was aware of, that sort of tension too. And I figured, well, I'm just going to have to keep working with myself over the years to somehow prune away these unacceptable parts of me. And yet I also didn't want to prune away these unacceptable parts of me. But that was I just kind of accepted that's the way my life was going to be, with kind of those internal difficulties. But by the same token, I also loved the fellowship, and I couldn't, to leave was kind of an unimaginable thing. Because it's like, what would I replace it with? And here I am, in a marriage with a husband who's devoted to the faith. And I don't know, and I've been taught that other churches are not right. And I, had this kind of discomfort with going in other churches because I had all this teaching that was, conditioning that was still in my head, even though it's not like I thought all these people were bad and wrong and going to hell. Still, that teaching, that conditioning can be really powerful. Even when you're directly questioning it, it can be really powerful. And so it left me in a point where I couldn't imagine not being in the fellowship. I couldn't imagine, leaving. I couldn't imagine how life would be any different. And so I figured I would just find a way to deal with it, basically.
Yeah. What did dealing with it mean? What did that entail?
Well, just kind of some of what I've been trying to talk about, the working with those parts of myself that weren't acceptable and learning to not express them, and basically learning to make the most of my life as it was and find the joys where the joys were, like in my children and reading books and all of that sort of stuff. And, I guess it was just a lot of that more internal work that I sought to do with myself to kind of keep myself in this place of, I don't know, submission isn't the right word. I don't think it's the right word, but it's what came to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Tried to learn how to submit, I don't know.
No, but I think I get what you're trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me more about your kids?
My kids?
Yeah. Would you be willing to?
Sure. So my oldest is Adair. He's 13. He was born in October of 2004. And Balin is, he just turned 11. He was born in February 2007. Corley is born in August of 2008. So she's 9. And then Delise is the littlest one. She was born in June of 2010. And, well, they're all pretty awesome in their own way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what kind of, I don't know, give me a little direction on, an idea of where to go.
So I guess I'd be interested to know, I guess first, when did you decide to come out to your family, and how did that shape, like, the relations
with my kids and stuff?
Yeah, like with your kids and your husband.
Well, I kind of just, going back, I'll backtrack a little bit, with the periods of depression and stuff that I had. Mm-hmm. So in my mid-30s, right after Delise was born, actually, then I kind of had this weird breakdown. It was a little bit psychotic or whatever. I mean, that's what I'd say. I mean, it was a little interesting. It was probably somewhat hormonally based. So I had that, and I started seeing this therapist, and actually that was a really good thing because, some of that, she started pointing out to me in ways that I hadn't been exactly looking at yet, where the incongruity was in my life. And so then I more openly talked about the fact that I had these feelings and this attraction, and what my sexuality and my orientation was. And so it was nice to have that experience of acceptance within the therapeutic setting. Mm-hmm. And yet it was like, from her perspective, it was also, well, I'd kind of made this choice already. I was married and I had kids, so for right now, that's the way it was. And that kind of helped a little bit. But then also I kind of fell in love with her too, because that's the cliche, you fall in love with your therapist, right? Only in my case, she was a woman, so. And so that, that put a lot of, that was emotionally difficult. I mean, and yet it was good for me too, because it offered a vehicle for exploring that identity and stuff. But then, my husband is not a dummy, or my ex-husband, he was not a dummy. And so he started figuring some stuff out, and, and I had explained to him pretty openly in the beginning, I had these experiences, I have these feelings, but I'm going to devote myself to the marriage. And so he believed that was fine. They would go away, I would, once I was married, and, things would be normal and I'd be normal and all that good stuff. And I kind of bought into that too. But, in the process of therapy, I started accepting, kind of bringing some of those incongruities with my religious beliefs and my sexuality up to the light and to work on them more. But it also put a strain in my relationship, and it kind of put a strain on me emotionally, and I ended up in a really, hellish sort of place. It was like a complete and total breakdown, and this was in the middle of the summer of 2011. And so when I started, I went to my parents for a while, for several months. And when I was in the process of starting to get better, first of all, what it felt like is that all of this, my inner self had kind of been wiped clean. It was like this barren wasteland type of thing. There was nothing left. But as I started getting better, I realized that this was actually a really beautiful thing, because I thought I can start completely over, because some of these foundations of my beliefs and myself and my core constructs have all been shaken and kind of shattered, and this is a good time to start over, and I'm going to learn how to be and live an authentic life. And so I determined that as part of that, I was going to start being a lot more honest with myself about my sexuality. And, I still wasn't envisioning it would lead to the, coming out more openly, leaving my fellowship, and all of that, and leaving the marriage and all of that. I didn't envision that, but what I envisioned was I'm going to live a more authentic life. I'm going to be more open and honest with the people that are close to me. I'm going to be more open and honest with my husband that these feelings haven't gone away. I, started developing some really good, healthy, strong friendships in which I felt safe to come out. I had a spiritual director for a while, and that was really great for me too. So it was kind of a gradual process. I started, first I just learned, I had this spiritual experience where I learned that, God, or whatever you want to call the organizing force of the universe, the supreme presence, the all that is, whatever. I have a lot of different words for this, but it was just, I had this sense that I was deeply loved just as I was, and that absolutely included my sexuality. And so that sense in me where there had just always been that core wound of I'm defective because of my sexuality, it got healed, and so I felt like a whole person. And for a while that was enough. For a while it was enough to tell my friends, and I thought, well, maybe this will be okay. But, it's kind of what I was mentioning earlier is, these things don't stay hidden. Things don't stay the same. As I progressed, it became more and more important to live more and more openly, and the choices that I was making had consequences. Choices always have consequences, and so it just kind of led into a whole lot of changes in my life, where I'm starting to go to a different church, and I'm really challenging more openly the beliefs that I had, and whether it was, worth my while to remain in the fellowship. And it was really hard to leave, and yet I ended up at a point where I accepted, me being openly who I am is really threatening to them. And it's really uncomfortable for them, and it's not, it's not healthy for them, it's not healthy for me, so I left. And by golly, if it doesn't appear that, it's gonna be too hard for the relationship to remain intact too, because it's hard for a guy to, he still loved me, he loved me as much as when he was pursuing me fiercely from Guatemala, and he didn't want to let me go, but he wanted me to be who he wanted me to be. And so in his mind, I was wrong in choosing to embrace my sexuality and all of who I was instead of trying to prune away those parts. I realized that it was actually wrong. I'd kind of been wrong all those years to be doing that. That was the wrong thing for me. And so I was finally doing the right thing for me, but it meant that our relationship was no longer right, and so I tried to be fair to him all along and talk about, how things were progressing, and, I started going to PFLAG, and, as kind of support, and, and that, having the support of people that would accept and embrace me for who I was, that was invaluable. Without developing that network of support, I probably couldn't have made some of those difficult decisions. And with my children, as things progressed, then I talked with each of them in ways that were more age appropriate. And I think it was then, maybe it was in 2016, it was in the summer, they went to one of those, a pride march with me. And they, and I explained to them, we're going because actually your mom is gay. And they're like, oh, that's cool. They thought it was pretty cool. They didn't have a problem with it because kind of as I had accepted myself more, I had, started being more intentional about putting those messages out there about equality and inclusiveness, and so they'd already started learning some of those things, and I wanted them to learn to be more open-minded, and that these differences were okay, that having a different sexuality than what was the typical sexuality was not a bad thing, and and as we've they had more exposure. We've talked about, transgender issues and all of that stuff. And I've been pretty open with them about all of that. And so, then when it came that we were going to get divorced, and then I explained to them, your dad has a really hard time with the changes I've made in my spirituality and the changes I've made in my sexuality that just make it hard for us to stay married. And they're like, okay, Mom. So your original question, I think, had to do with my children.
Yeah.
And I told you the whole story because I'm good at that.
Yeah, that was a really cohesive narrative. That was very good. I
probably answered a lot of your questions.
You did answer a lot of my questions, which is awesome.
Without you having to ask them.
So you did mention PFLAG. Was this your first sort of contact with an LGBT group?
Yeah, and I knew that they had existed, for some time before that. I mean, I'd been downtown sometimes during some of the Kool-Aid days, parades or whatever, when, and I'd see PFLAG go by and I'd see people holding their signs, and it always kind of gave me a little bit of, an interesting feeling, kind of jealous that they could be open about it, but kind of glad that they were there, that they existed. So I knew they existed, and then I found the Facebook group online, and then I had some, I knew Judy, I got to know Judy Sandine, I guess, because I started going to Prairie Loft, and then, Amy and Judy's her mom.
Yeah.
So I just started getting kind of connected in ways like that kind of just naturally drew me into the next step of actually going. And once I went, then I was really glad,
yeah,
to be a part of the group.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you may have said it, but how did you end up in Hastings? When and how?
The reason for that is that when my ex-husband left the ministry, then he came here, because he was pretty good at planning out things, and so he came here to go to CCC to get an information technology degree, an associate's in that. And so he was living here in Hastings, and so then when we got married, then I lived here in Hastings.
Okay. Yeah.
So I've lived here since 2003 then.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any kind of expectations for your contact with PFLAG? What were your expectations going in?
Oh my gosh, well, I really kind of had no idea what to expect. I had no idea. But I just, as far as actually having a hope, I just hoped that I would find a group of supportive, caring people, that would understand more what I was going through and, accept me for who I was, just the sexuality would be okay. It would, obviously there wasn't gonna be any conflict around that, and I could kind of just relax and be who I was, and that would be a perfectly normal and natural thing in that environment, in that group. And also, I really did hope that I would find people that kind of help me with some of the religious issues that I had. I mean, because that kind of adds an extra component to it. I mean, not everybody has kind of come from such an interesting religious background or whatever. So, I kind of hoped there would be somebody that would kind of be able to understand more of that or help me make sense of that, somebody I could relate to as far as those experiences and healing those wounds and, kind of learn how to explore that together. I mean, because my friends could listen, but obviously they hadn't grown up gay. They hadn't grown up gay in an ultra-stifling religious environment. They didn't have some of those ingrained issues that are relevant to being gay in an ultra-religious background, So
yeah,
I kind of hoped that I would find some understanding for that, or somebody that I could relate with.
And did you find that there?
You know, in its own way. I mean, obviously everybody's story is different, and so there wasn't really anybody at that time with a story quite like mine, but, you know, and yet it was an environment where I could tell my story more and have people that would listen, at least, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but then eventually there was an individual that came in the group who's come out as, you know, transgender since, and at that point he was still identifying as he, but he is now she. So she grew up Catholic and had wanted to go into the seminary, you know, and then had gotten rejected from that when it came out. You know, at that point he was saying, I'm gay. And, you know, then the gender dysphoria issues, and then putting all that together, they said, yeah, so, you know, this particular person, we kind of clicked on that issue, you know, and yeah, so we could be of help to each other, I guess. You know, and I think it was good for her at that point to have somebody like me who had, you know, more of an understanding of, you know, how hard it really is to kind of leave a religion that is deeply ingrained in you like that, to overcome some of that conditioning, if you will, and yeah, how you deal with that, you know, when spirituality is an extremely important part of your identity, and yet, you know, you've experienced spiritual abuse in a sense too.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How big was PFLAG when you first started going?
You know, the size of meetings could vary, but I remember, like, at my first meeting, it seemed like there was probably 15 people or so there.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And did you have a sense of how long, or do you have a sense of how long PFLAG has been in the community, has been a part of Hastings?
I do, but I don't remember the exact date.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, I don't. Somewhere in the, I'd like to say kind of around 2007 or something.
Okay.
You know, since Judy Sandine was involved more in, you know, kind of, she was instrumental in getting some of that stuff going. Like, I think she was instrumental in getting something started, support groups started here at the college. And I think she was a part of the original PFLAG too. And so it's at least 10 years or more that PFLAG has been in Hastings, I think.
Okay.
At least 10 years. But don't quote me on that, because I don't remember the...
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Yeah.
What kind of changes have you seen with PFLAG since the time you joined up to now?
Well, one thing is there's a lot more transgender visibility. And it's, you know, in my initial meeting, I think there were like 3 transgender individuals in my first meeting, you know, and I didn't have much, well, I just didn't have a lot of knowledge anyway. I mean, I'd been doing some of my own research anyway, but I had not had much experience, you know, actually being around, you know, this population or whatever, you know. So for me, it was a really welcome experience, because I got to be with these people and get to know them, you know, just as people, and get to understand more about what the transgenders, you know, growing up and having gender dysphoria and being transgender, and, you know, the stigmatization and, you know, the pain and the challenges that went along with that.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the coming out. So I learned that the coming out process as transgender is a lot more involved in a lot of ways than, you know, coming out as gay. And that's not to diminish the fact that mine was a painful process, or that it is a painful process. But, you know, I learned that there's a lot of complexity involved in coming out as transgender, and, you know, a lot more layers of issues. There's a lot more visible things that are going on. I mean, you know, visible physical changes, legal changes, social changes, whatnot. And I can come out as gay and I still look as like the same person. And I can walk down the street and people don't necessarily know that I'm gay, because that's not announcing itself all over me, you know, despite what people say about gaydar. It's not like there's a flashing neon sign that says this person is gay, but when you're starting to go through a gender transition process, that's a lot more visible and that's a lot more noticeable, and there's a lot more challenges that go along with that. So, coming to PFLAG and becoming more aware of those experiences and getting to know the people who are going through those experiences gave me a lot deeper understanding that, I've been grateful for over the years.
Yeah.
And so as far as, changes in ways that I've seen PFLAG develop, I've seen PFLAG develop towards, in this area, towards a greater knowledge and understanding of, the transgender experience in Hastings too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what it's like, what it's like to be transgender in Hastings.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
How large would you say that population is?
I'm becoming more aware of people all the time. Right now, I'd say I know at least 10 people in Hastings who are.
Mm-hmm. And then just what about the LGBT community more generally? How, if you had to throw a guess at how big that is?
I don't know, really. I get surprised all the time by, a lot of people are in a place in their lives where they're really comfortable with who they are, really comfortable in their relationships, and they don't feel the need to come to support meetings, PFLAG meetings as much. It's not that they're not involved or supportive at all, but, I'd say, the PFLAG involvement, like if you have this circle here, people that come to PFLAG, this is a smaller circle, and I think there's actually a pretty large circle of people who would identify as various, sexual identities or gender identities as well in Hastings.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, I keep being surprised more all the time when, I meet couples or whatever.
Yeah.
But, when I started getting involved in PFLAG, and then I became kind of more aware of, the presence of LGBTQ people in the community, I was amazed at how many, there actually were. I mean, because for a while, even if you technically or intellectually know you're not alone, you can kind of feel alone, like you're just a very small minority. But it's been comforting to me to realize, exactly how many members of the community there are in Hastings. And then even more so, it was really beautiful to learn how many supportive, affirming people there are in Hastings. If you're going to be LGBTQ plus, in a relatively conservative town in Nebraska, Hastings is a good place to be as far as that goes, because there's a really strong, affirming element in Hastings. And I didn't know about that until I started getting more involved in PFLAG and, and more involved through the church where I go, where there's, I started just learning how many affirming people there were, and it was pretty amazing to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That surprises me too, because that was one of my questions, is the sort of the rest of the community, how what their perceptions are like. So I'm pleasantly surprised
Yeah.
to hear that. Were you aware, or have you become aware of any local LGBTQs civil rights efforts in Hastings in the last, or since you've come out or since you've joined PFLAG? Has there been any local civil rights efforts that you've heard of?
Well, there's probably, there's advocacy efforts. I mean, that's one of the branches of PFLAG, and, some of the pride marches or the pride festivals that we had are, efforts along those lines. More of the marches or whatnot that I've been involved in kind of are they're a little bit more general, I suppose, like diversity, equality, kind of that more general message, which also includes, the LGBTQ plus community. But recently, anyway, I'm noticing a lot more issues that are centering around, immigration, the rights of, undocumented workers or whatever, the DACA, the Dreamers, and there's been a lot of efforts around that. So, I think more the issues that are going on in Hastings, more of the actual civil rights efforts are a little more centered around the racial diversity. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do those intersect in any way with PFLAG's?
I think they do.
goals?
I mean, because, the messages of diversity and unity and equality do intersect. And one thing I know I'd like to do, since I'm now the vice president of PFLAG, but one of the advocacy efforts I'd like us to be more involved in is, where LGBTQI issues and color intersect, because like transgender women of color are especially at risk, And so I think it's going to be important for us to stand up a little more and highlight some more of those issues, where the racial and the sexuality issues intersect. Because really no particular issue is separate in and of itself. I mean, there is always that connection.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very true.
Mm-hmm.
What else? I got all kinds of stuff. Are there any sites or places in Hastings that you're aware of that are like affiliated with the LGBTQ community? Like, if you could think of like one place.
You mean like safe spaces or businesses that are supportive
anything.
or whatever? Like if you look on the Hastings PFLAG page, we have quite a list going of businesses in Hastings that are welcoming. Even just downtown, there's several that I could think of right off the bat. I mean, there's the Blue Moon, and the previous owner, he was openly gay, and the owner of Odyssey, he's openly gay, and he's in a relationship. He doesn't make a huge display of it, but nonetheless. So we do have, there's even a fair number of business owners that are themselves a part of the community. Not necessarily that they come to PFLAG, but they're part of the larger LGBTQ plus community. So, I mean, you have a lot of businesses downtown that are affirming, or they're run by someone who is associated with the community or a member of the community. You have a lot of other individuals and businesses they're not as open, and that's, they're welcoming, and yet they're not as open about it, because there is still that element in Hastings where, these particular business owners feel like they need to respect the fact that some of their customers or the people they provide service to are not necessarily comfortable with some of the ideas of being affirming and accepting.
You mentioned safe spaces. Is there like a good safe space here in the community for people?
Well, I think that's something that we specifically need, is like a definite designated safe space. And so, that's one of the ideas that I have, that I would like to be instrumental in implementing through PFLAG. But also I'm interested in it from my own background, being a counseling student, and I'm going to be a counselor. And so one of the issues is I would like to, be able to provide a space where, LGBTQ plus members could kind of receive some counseling or that sort of support as well. So creation of a safe space where some of those resources were available. And so that is an idea that I have, and I think there's, some investment in that idea amongst the PFLAG board of directors and stuff, for, if we could find a space and we could set up a safe space, where people could come, not just like, the PFLAG meeting, like that's a safe space, but then those meetings happen once a month.
Yeah.
And, so there's not like this designated gathering space where it would be a safe place to go for support or comfort or counseling or whatever, on a regular basis. And so I would like to get something like that created and set up, if we could have like a room or with office spaces available or whatever, and and not only just that, but have more of a definite collection of resources, because it's not always clear, like say for transgender people, what, who's a safe medical provider to go to, or,
Yeah.
But if you're going to ask questions about medical providers, there are actually some medical providers in Hastings that really are willing to work with transgender people. Like at the Family Medical Center, her name is Brenda Nunley, and I think she's working with some of the transgender people that I know, and they really think she's great. She's really willing to educate herself and do what, learn what she needs to do for them, learn about their needs, try to meet those needs in the most accessible and affirming way possible. And
And that's fantastic to
It
have
is.
someone in the medical community
Mhm.
willing to kind of step up with that.
And I think there's counselors that are open in Hastings, but I don't think that there's a lot of counselors who have more of an understanding of transgender issues. So that's a need that I think is looking to be filled.
Yeah. And you've kind of hit on this a little bit, but what was the climate toward the LGBT community like in Nebraska growing up compared to how it is now? Have you seen a change in the climate?
Definitely. I mean, definitely. Yeah. When I was growing up, it was still, well, and you kind of have to take into account that I was a little bit more isolated than the average person. Partly because I did grow up in the panhandle, so there was a little bit of that geographic isolation. Sometimes it was hard to conceive of the rest of Nebraska when you were out there in the sandhills, so there was kind of that isolation that I had, a little bit of social isolation, and it was pre-internet basically, so information didn't get around in the same way it does now. And then there was just the religious influence that kept me a little bit more isolated. So I don't know that I was totally aware of, I don't know. But as far as I knew, it wasn't really a thing that was talked about a lot. And if it was talked about, it was not approved of.
Yeah.
And it was just one of those things where you understood this is not acceptable. You won't talk about this, that sort of thing. That was definitely the way it was in my faith fellowship that I grew up in, And I think it was more that way in society too, at least in Nebraska, because Nebraska's always been a much more conservative state, and kind of the general personality of Nebraskans is if you don't need to talk about it, you don't talk about it, or at least it was then, and so it wasn't talked about, I think. But yet I think it's not that people were unaware that it existed, it was not, the appropriate thing to talk about, or people just didn't talk about it, just didn't want to look at it. And I think that, as far as things changing, I think that's changed more. I think more of these conversations are happening. There's more awareness. I think you still get more pushback in some of the more rural towns, with people that are holding on to, their older beliefs, and it's hard to, I can understand from my own experience, it's hard to let go of conditioning and beliefs that are pretty deeply rooted. And so, but I think there's a lot more willingness, at least in this state, for people to open their minds more and look at the possibility that this is okay. This is about love. This is about people loving each other. And that's actually not a wrong thing,
Yeah.
So I think there's, more open-mindedness in Nebraska than there used to be.
Okay. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Have you personally experienced or not necessarily experienced, but witnessed discrimination or hostility based on your identity?
When we've done our pride marches, there's a few people that have gone by, or they'd flip us off or say something really rude. And here's the surprising thing, though. The people that were supportive and affirming outweighed those people. And so, yes, I've been aware that there's people that are really, hold on to some hateful attitudes or whatnot. And, it was, when was it? It was in last August or whatever, and there was different signs that were around town. And a lot of them were racially, it was racial hate, but there were also, there's hate directed towards the LGBTQ plus community too. That was this, you could look at that as the work of one disturbed individual. And so I'm not really aware of any concerted group hate efforts in the community. And I personally have not been harassed by anyone. But then again, like I say, it's that passing thing. I mean, I can walk down the street and there is not the flashing sign over my head that says, guess what? I have an alternative sexual identity. Harass me for it. So if I don't announce it, people tend to, it's kind of instead of receiving stigmatization or harassment, it's kind of more the opposite, where there's this assumption that I belong to a certain identity, because that's just still there's still a lot of that heteronormative stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not like I want to wear a sign that says I'm gay. So I don't always feel it necessary to correct that assumption, but
yeah,
more of what I experience is just the assumption that I'm straight or whatever.
Yeah.
Unless I were to actually, someday have a relationship and walk down the street holding the hand of a woman, then, I might have a totally different experience in that case. There might be some weird looks that I got, and and I wouldn't say that this is directly harassment or anything, but I remain Facebook friends with a lot of people from my former church, and I know a lot of them don't approve of who I am or the choices I've made and all of that, and yet instead of ever confronting me about it, they just choose to never address it. And I have a blog, and I have a coming out post on my blog, and lots of people read that particular post. And so, it's there, but the people that I know who are uncomfortable with that sort of thing or disagree have chosen not to address it with me. Except for, there was, a couple of people who did engage me more in the conversation, and it kind of went to the verse in Romans where, don't you know these are unnatural practices, and et cetera. And I'm just kind of thinking, well, you're not really aware of the whole context of what was going on in Roman culture, and you aren't aware of the linguistic subtleties in Greek, and how things have been lost in translation from the original languages into this English, and you don't know that you're projecting your 20th century views back onto the Bible and assuming this is what Paul was talking about. So, sometimes I realized that there was no point in engaging in those conversations, because, the Bible doesn't necessarily say what people think it says, but, a lot of times we get attached to a meaning, and it's like, it means this because this is what I taught, and I'm not going to hear what it might mean something different.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah. But, I still didn't necessarily term those conversations as like harassment or bullying or anything. It's just people, they were expressing their views, and I expressed my views, and we left it there, and it was a civil conversation. I mean,
Yeah.
these are decent people, they're not going to engage in really hateful rhetoric, so I haven't really ever had hateful rhetoric directed at me. I've just been aware of waves of disapproval projected at me, yes, but Hatefulness, I have not actually directly experienced that. Even my experiences when I talked with my mentor friend way back when, and obviously she didn't approve, but she was never hateful. And the awkward conversation I had with the head minister, there was really nothing ever hateful about it. It was just the assumption that they understood the morally right thing and I didn't, and
Yeah.
just that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So none of that I don't categorize. You can call it spiritual abuse in a sense if you want, and I think there's elements of that, and yet these people were not trying to behave in abusive ways. So
Yeah.
somewhere in there I got to your question.
No, I think you did. I think you did answer.
Okay.
You did answer it. I'm just curious to know if there is a place in Hastings that has any kind of association with LGBT women specifically. Is there a kind of place or spot, or
Like, do we have our own particular spot?
or is there a spot associated with women in that community, like that they've done something? I don't know. I'm just curious.
Is that kind of part of your project where you're looking for sites or spaces that are relevant to
Mhm.
like LGBTQ plus women in particular? I'm not really aware of that. Because, I don't know, partly, if there are like I think there are party spots or gathering spots or whatnot. But because I'm a mother of 4 kids, and I'm
Yeah.
a graduate student, and I haven't been, done much of that party stuff. But I don't really think that there is like this specific LGBTQ plus women's spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just thought I'd ask
Mm-hmm.
in case there was.
Well,
But
if there is, I'm not really aware of what it is.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned PFLAG. Are there any other sort of like groups or institutions, might be kind of too formal of a word, but are there any other kind of like groups that are sort of created by and for the community?
You mean like inclusive of gays, lesbian, transgender, so on and so forth?
Mm-hmm.
Some members of PFLAG, some of the transgender members, have put together a transgender support group. Like transgender and non-binary support group, because actually there's a lot of different people who identify as non-binary too that have come to our PFLAG meetings, and so then some of them have put together this support group for that, and it kind of rotates between Kearney, Hastings, and Grand Island.
Okay.
And typically meets at the library. And without outing anybody in particular, there are some members of the community that work at the library, who identify as non-binary or gay, or Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Interesting. That's good to know.
So the library is a welcoming space too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And some pretty good allies work there too. There's a lot of really staunch allies in Hastings.
Yeah. That's good.
Some of them are more vocal and some of them are quieter, but they're all there nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you perceive to be the role of women in maintaining groups like PFLAG or maintaining groups like the transgender and non-binary support group? Like, do women have a role in, like, what is women's role in that?
Well,
or what do you perceive it to be?
well, this kind of goes, I guess, into some of the social conditioning that goes along with gender roles or whatever, and women are perceived as, taking more nurturing roles or whatnot. And I, know that not all women identify with that particular role, but I think that nonetheless it is, it has been an element in the role that a lot of women have played. There's women like Judy Sandine, I'd say, and there's a strong nurturing element in her. And I think in my approach, there's a lot of that nurturing element. It's just a little bit more, I guess some of my answer is going to be kind of personally based, but, and I'm a pretty strong proponent of mindfulness and of, effective communication skills and learning how to engage in peaceful communication and promote this sort of listening, where people can come and tell their stories and be heard. I think women have been instrumental, it's going back to speaking generally, I think women have been instrumental in opening up kind of nurturing spaces where, listening is an important part of inviting people in and letting them know your story matters, you matter, come and tell your story and we'll listen and we'll support you, that sort of thing. So inviting people that tell their stories, I think, it's not necessarily just a woman's only thing, but I think women have been instrumental in supporting and nurturing that part of, the community.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Do traditional gender roles persist in the LGBTQ community?
To a certain extent. I mean, you might find people that are really struggling against them.
Mm-hmm.
You might find people that are still attached to them. But I mean, because we live in the main society and this, it's heteronormative and we all kind of have been touched by that conditioning, it does come into the communities too. I mean, you'll find people that have totally cast it off and they want nothing to do with it. You'll find people that have tried to adapt some of it, let go of some of it. You'll find people that are really holding on to it. But, and this kind of goes back to maybe some of the questions that we get from people that aren't part of the community is, that the questions are kind of based, on the understanding of these traditional gender roles, like who's the guy and who's the top, who's the bottom, that sort of thing, like assuming that there has to be this division of roles, and there sometimes it's just not that way. We haven't gender typed, people in a same gender relationship haven't necessarily gender typed, who does this and who's that, who's the more feminine, who's the more masculine, so I think there is a move within the LGBTQ plus community to let go of a lot of that genderized, thinking about who should do what in a relationship and make it more of an egalitarian type of thing. But you can also find that in regular society is there's more of a move towards that. So I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, I think you did. I don't know if I quite framed it the right way either, but I think you got at what I was wondering.
Well, some of those questions are probably pretty challenging to both word them sensitively and yet get it,
Yeah.
the point that you're wanting to ask about.
Get information. Yeah, still get the information. And so I guess I'm also curious about sort of expectations, because certainly heterosexual women have a set of expectations that are sort of dictated by society in a number of different ways. Are there different expectations for women who don't identify as heterosexual, or do expectations exist at all?
Oh, expectations do exist. I mean, some of the same basic concepts or phenomena you find in regular society, you're going to find in the LGBTQ plus community too. This sense of we want to label people, put them in boxes, categorize them, create these roles. And so, yeah, there's all sorts of roles and all sorts of expectations that go along with these roles in the LGBTQ plus community as much as in, the heteronormative community. And, by the same token, you find people that are always fighting against all of those expectations and raging against them. And, yeah. So, I mean, one of the expectations that I've felt, is that, well, you come out as gay, then you get involved in a relationship. Or kind of, to be really gay, you have to be in a relationship. Or to be really gay, you have to leave your marriage. Like, if you come out as a gay woman, you had better, the expectation, I guess, is that you will leave your husband and get divorced, and you'll go immediately be with a woman. And I dealt with that during my whole process of, when I thought I would stay in my marriage, I kind of battled against that idea. You don't have to leave your marriage to be yourself. You really don't. And despite the fact I ended up divorced because that was the right thing for us, I still don't think that, to be properly gay, that a woman or a man has to leave their relationship. I mean, if there's ways in which this relationship is beautiful and satisfying to them, then who cares what people think that they should do? Mm-hmm. And even now, kind of one of my expectations was that I should be in a relationship. And I did kind of play around with one for a little while, but it wasn't right. And so now I'm kind of learning to be happy being single. And I mean, it doesn't make me any less gay just because I'm not in a relationship. So I think there's some of that, I guess that's my personal experience, but yeah. I think there is some of that in general, like, to kind of be really gay or whatever, you need to be actively engaged in some sort of relationship or activity that aligns with your chosen identity. But your identity is your identity, whether or not you have all these supporting elements that people think should go along with it,
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I want to hear more about just like, well, you've mentioned you're a graduate student.
Right.
For counseling?
Yes.
So can you tell me more about that?
Well, I am getting a Master's of Science in Clinical Counseling. And actually right now I am in the process of my first internship. So I will have 2 more, and that is all I have left.
Congrats.
And then, yes, I will graduate next, I will finish my internship. If all goes well, I'll finish at the end of November, and I'll be able to graduate next January. So that will be totally awesome.
And where's that program? Is that like an online
thing? I'm doing that through Bellevue University.
Oh, okay.
Which is why I was kind of, brought that up earlier. I was a little bit curious about the history there. Bellevue College, Bellevue University, whatever, yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's been really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been able to do that online, and it's flexible and it's convenient. It's fit into my life a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually, when things were kind of in a turmoil with leaving the church and leaving my marriage, and for a little bit there, I was thinking, how am I going to maintain, how can I keep up with my studies when I have all this stress going on? But it actually anchored me a lot because I could forget about, some of what I was going through, and I had something to focus on and the work to do, and it was really good to have that focus. Mm-hmm.
So then, do you still plan to stay in Hastings once you get your degree?
Yeah, I have some ideas for what type of practice I'd like to have, because I'm also interested in meditative practices and meditation, mindfulness. And I also am getting a certification for Yoga Nidra. I taught that class at Avani for like over a year and a half almost. I don't have it right now, but we might bring back some new iteration of the class in the summer, I think. But so I want to take like my passion and my skills and training in those areas and apply them to my skills and training in psychotherapy, and also my skills and training in the area of spirituality, and kind of find a way to integrate all of that and offer sort of a unique service that also is multiculturally sensitive and maybe in a lot of ways directed towards some of the needs of the LGBTQ plus community. Because I think there's, I'm aware there's some spiritual needs that don't really get addressed in a lot of the transition process, and the individuals I know and the struggles they've had. And, I think it would be helpful to be able to have somebody who has training and experience in both, psychotherapeutic techniques and specific counseling, but also, a spiritual background to kind of be able to meet some of those needs. So I'd like to form a practice like that also is sensitive and, would have a specialty area towards, the LGBTQ plus population. And my idea about the safe space creation, kind of maybe ties in a little bit with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a lot of ideas.
Yeah.
For what I'd like to do with all of my training and experience and stuff.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
That's exciting.
And now it's on tape, so.
Now you have to do it. You've committed now.
Yes, somebody will listen to my words and come for them.
What role does religion continue to play in your life?
Still pretty important to me. Well, if we could talk about the distinction between religion and spirituality. I think religion itself is less important to me than spirituality. Because I don't really think of myself as a religious person, and I never really did. I'm more interested in the spiritual component, which is this universal seeking and searching toward a sense of the sacred, and it is to me, the spiritual is a more universal thing. The religion can consist of, specific ritualized practices or adhering to a certain ideology or certain being, a certain affiliation. And yes, I do belong to the First Presbyterian Church, but I am by no means an adherent of a specific theology. So my spirituality, is like more of an overarching type of thing, where I feel it's important for me to maintain a sense of connection to the sacred, whether I call that God, whether, even I've read a lot of Buddhist philosophy, and, I read Thich Nhat Hanh. Have you ever heard of him? Mm-mm. He's pretty cool. He's worth reading. So you read these books by these Buddhist monks, and they don't really have a problem using the term God, because they're not using it in, the kind of a Christian conceptualization. They're using it in this really broad, ultimate reality sense. And so that's kind of where I come from with my spirituality and my views, and kind of the way I aim to live and interact with others is, for myself, maintaining that sense of the sacred so that I can see the sacred that's in others, and, maybe help them see that too, and find ways to honor that in themselves. I don't feel like you have to belong to a specific religion, but I feel there's a spiritual element in all of us that needs to be nourished.
Yeah.
So.
I think that's a good place to leave it. Unless you have anything else you'd like to include.
That is probably a good place to leave it too.
Awesome. Well,